Now let's assume you're getting ready to take off on an instrument flight and it is a really crummy day. In fact, it's so crummy that you're going to go into the clouds immediately right after takeoff. Well, there's some things you can do on the ground to make that immediate transition to instruments go a lot smoother. First of all, make sure you really understand your clearance. Make sure that you can visualize which way you're going to turn right after takeoff. Now, while you're here in the run-up area, it's a good idea to get all your avionics set up. I like to use a flow procedure and use the radio stack as a reminder. I go from top to bottom to make sure I have everything set up all right. Other pilots like to use the audio panel, and they use it as a checklist to make sure they've remembered everything. One way or the other, you want to make sure that you use some kind of flow procedure or checklist to make sure that you've remembered everything. Now, I like to set the first two frequencies I'll be using on the flight in the number 1 comm radio. In the active position, I put the tower frequency, or Unicom if I'm not at a tower, and in the standby position, I put departure control. And that way, if the tower tells me to switch to departure control, all I have to do is hit the transfer button. Now, in the number 1 VOR, I set the frequency of the VOR I'm going to first use for navigation, and in the OBS, I'll set the course I'm going to intercept or fly. Now, if I have a problem after I take off, I'm going to want to go back to an airport that has an instrument approach. So in the standby, in the number 1 nav, I like to set up the frequency I'd use to make that instrument approach. Now, you could use your number 2 VOR for any number of things. For instance, you could set it to a VOR off to the side of your route of flight and use it to get radials to find out where you are and keep track of your position. You could also use your number 2 radio to kind of get ahead on your navigation by setting in the second leg of your route and then setting the OBS to the second leg. That's what I like to do, and that's what I'm going to do in this particular case. And what that does is gives me 2 legs ahead on my flight, my navigation, and gives me a contingency plan so I can concentrate on my flying. Now, in the transponder, you want to make sure you've set in your squawk code, and of course make sure it's set to standby, because I'm going to set it to altitude just as I take the runway for takeoff. Now, it's very important that you have some kind of plan to keep track of all the things you need to keep track of when you're flying IFR in the air. For instance, in my case, I like to use the heading bug, and I set it to remember my heading. And for going back to a previous frequency, I use the standby frequency, and that way all I have to do is hit the flip-flop to go back to a previous frequency. For altitudes, I like to write down my altitude on a sheet of paper. Other people use devices like the ADF. They use the frequencies on the ADF, or the ADF card, rotate it to, say, 10 for 1,000 and 20 for 2,000 and so on. And some people like to go even further. They like to use a piece of paper with 3 columns on it. One column would be your heading, another column would be your altitude, and the third column would be your frequency. But whatever system you use, it's important that you do have a system for keeping track of all of the things you need to keep track of when you're IFR. And use that system every time, and things go a lot smoother for you in the air. Okay, we've done our run-up. Everything's all set. We're ready to go. Now, lots of pilots get disoriented if they happen to be looking outside the window right when they go into the clouds. So it's a good idea to get the airplane climbing, in trim, and then go on instruments right away before you enter the clouds. Now, if you really are IFR at low altitude, you really want to do things right. So what are your priorities? Well, there are 2. Number 1, keep the airplane climbing. Make sure you've pitched up on the attitude indicator and use the VSI and altimeter to verify that the airplane is indeed climbing. And by the way, this is no time to get distracted and let the airplane fly back into the ground. So for the first 400 feet or so, don't do anything that's not necessary that might distract you from climbing. And fly the proper heading. That's rule number 2. Obstacle clearance and traffic separation depend on it. And even if you're given a heading to fly right after takeoff, don't fly that heading until you get to 400 feet above ground level. Because in order to keep you from being distracted, all IFR departure procedures and clearances assume that you aren't going to turn until you get to 400 feet. So that's all there is to it. Keep the airplane climbing and point it in the right direction, and you'll be okay. Now, after you've had time to get your aircraft stabilized, if you're talking to a tower, the controller will tell you to talk to departure control. Now, when you contact departure control, you should tell them the altitude you're leaving, your assigned altitude, and your assigned heading, if any. For instance, you might say something like, SoCal departure, this is Cessna 359er Echo Sierra, leaving 900, climbing to 3,000, assigned heading 270. Now, this lets the controller verify your altitude readout on his screen and confirms your assigned heading and altitude. Now, this all works so much better if you've remembered to set the proper code in your transponder and to set it to altitude before takeoff. Otherwise, you're going to end up fumbling with it in the air and not particularly impress that controller. Well, as you can see, an instrument departure is really no big deal, as long as you remember your essential job is to follow the two most important rules for an IFR departure, and they are keep it climbing and fly the proper heading. Follow those two rules and keep them in mind right after takeoff, and you'll be just fine.